relative or brother who was sort of in orders or a nun.
De Valera's landmark constitution of 1937 avoided making Catholicism the state religion, offering instead a vaguer special position. Since the 19th century, church power had been deeply embedded. Ireland was a nation of mass devotion, and the overwhelming majority of children were educated in church-run schools. But this central role came at a price. Church control of education was close to absolute, but its power also extended deep into the criminal justice system. This is the old Letterfrack industrial school in County Galway. It was one of a network of such institutions up and down the country, where the state consigned children. Many of these institutions were set up under British rule. The new rulers of Ireland would prove as inadequate as the old in protecting the young. Physical and sexual abuse on a large scale was part of the secret history of the new state.
You were constantly waiting to be set upon. St. Joseph's Industrial School, Letterfrack, was an extremely violent place in an extremely violent Irish society.
Mannix Flynn, who came from a poor Dublin background, was sent to Letterfrack in the early 1960s.
An individual I saw one night being dragged out of the bed, his head beaten against the wall. What blood came out of the person, the brother then dragged this young boy up and down the dormitory, wiping him in his own blood to clean it off the floor. Depending on what kind of venom the individual who was perpetrating the violence on you, whatever brother or whatever civilian it was that was attached to the school, it could last for weeks. They were children from working class backgrounds, from mixed families. Some of them were the children of mothers who had children out of wedlock. Some of them were from other institutions, having been in orphanages and orphaned. They were the dirty poor that didn't fit into the emerging Irish Catholic middle classes. This society, since the foundation of the state, has continued the containment of a class of people, a segregation of a class of people, that it sees as kind of God's mistake.
Church influence spread far beyond the care of the young. From the bishop's palaces came regular diktats on cultural morality. Eamon de Valera's friend, the Archbishop of Dublin, John Charles McQuaid, kept a close eye on the Republic's creative spirits. His files are a trove of insight into the thinking of the Archbishop on a whole range of issues. This is the box relating to censorship, and in it there's a letter from a parish priest who wants to put on a showing for his parishioners of the Oscar-winning movie Gigi. But the plan has to be abandoned. Why? Well, according to this file, the film contains a reference to a prostitute. Banned were some of the greatest names in the Irish literary canon: James Joyce, George Bernard Shaw, Frank O'Connor, and scores of others. And yet, in this atmosphere of constraint, Irish literature flourished.
Literature acquired a kind of weird glamour by virtue of being persecuted, probably in the way it did in Soviet Russia. If you say these people are important enough to suppress, you are saying they are very damned important.
Remarkable talents like Flann O'Brien produced defiantly Irish masterpieces in a European surrealist tradition.
It's as if the radicalism got annulled in political politics and rerouted almost entirely into literature. The more repression there was at an official daylight level, the more creatively deranged the texts produced. It's as if the Irish were straights by day and swingers by night.
De Valera followed church advice on morality, but it was not his obsession. From the time he came to power in 1932 through his 16 years in office, his central preoccupation was Irish sovereignty. When World War II broke out, De Valera resisted Churchill's urgings to join the fight. Ireland remained neutral.
There was a considerable degree of public support for that stance, and there was a considerable degree of pride in the idea that we could go our own way. Partly because this is a country that is still relatively raw from the Civil War, and if De Valera had decided to go in and fight on the part of the Allies, it could well have divided the body politic.
But it was an ambiguous neutrality. When the German Air Force attacked Belfast, De Valera sent firemen to help fight the blaze. Germans bailing out over the south were interned, while their Allied counterparts were allowed to return to Ulster. When the IRA declared war against Britain, De Valera imprisoned and even executed its members. Yet on Hitler's death, De Valera offered his condolences to Germany. While Europe burned, De Valera set out his vision for an Ireland that would be distinctive in its culture and values.
The Ireland that we dreamed of would be the home of a people who valued material wealth only as a basis for right living, of a people who, satisfied with frugal comfort, devoted their leisure to the things of the spirit, a land whose countryside would be bright with cozy homesteads, with the romping of sturdy children and the laughter of happy maidens.
Yet to cast this giant of the Irish 20th century as an inward-looking nationalist would be wrong. He had chaired the League of Nations.
The avoidance of wars and of the burden of preparatory armament is of such concern to humanity that no state should be permitted to jeopardize the common interest by selfish action contrary to the covenant.
When the League was succeeded by the United Nations, De Valera made striking gestures of independence. From Dublin came his instructions to support Red China's application to join the UN, to the horror of America. He established the commitment which saw Irish troops serve in their thousands on peacekeeping missions. There is a real paradox here. De Valera was well aware of Ireland's international role. Yet his vision for the Irish demanded that they remain uncontaminated by foreign ideas. It was a vision at odds with modernity. Economic conflict with Britain had damaged Ireland at the outset of his rule. Stagnation deepened with the years. Around 500,000 people would leave Ireland, most seeking a better life in Britain, the country De Valera had spent his life fighting against for Irish sovereignty.
If you had to characterise the Ireland of De Valera, how would you describe it?
Very inward-looking, very complacent, and most of all, very poor. The last week in secondary school, the headmaster came in and asked us, those of us who were in the class, there were about 30 of us in the class, how many of us saw our future in Ireland? And the answer was 2 out of the 30. I was one of those 2, by the way.
By the time De Valera retired at the age of 77, Ireland wanted change. The leader who took over in 1959 was another veteran of revolution, but he displayed a steely pragmatism utterly different from De Valera's mystical vision of Irishness. Sean Lemass encouraged foreign investment, removed trade barriers, urged efficiency and modernisation in industry.
We started off like all the other newly freed countries with the assumption that freedom alone was enough and that in freedom economic difficulties would right themselves. We found out the hard way that this wasn't so.
Ireland had begun to catch up with the great post-war modernisation. The young were beneficiaries of free secondary education and a society again open to outside cultural influence. Television challenged the voice of both priest and politician. women joined the workforce in growing numbers and challenged discriminatory laws. And across the border, the changing world of the 60s seemed to inspire a new kind of unionism. A leader emerged who offered a friendlier face to the Catholic minority and to the South.
I was going to see a girl at one moment.
In January 1965, O'Neill and Lemass made history by meeting together at Stormont, the beginnings of North-South détente.
How important is that moment?
I think it's symbolically of huge significance. This is the first official meeting of the two heads of state since the 1920s.
We discussed this actually during our meeting, which of us would get into the most trouble. I said I would, and he said he would. He did get into a certain amount of trouble during the first 6 weeks, but nothing to the trouble that I got into.
Captain O'Neill recently said that the south of Ireland was a very beautiful young lady, and that he was very glad to talk to her over the hedge. We don't look upon the south of Ireland as a beautiful young lady.
The Liberal aspirations are very much overdue, but part of the difficulty with the O'Neill project is O'Neill himself. But O'Neill is an extraordinarily patrician figure who does not connect with nationalism or unionism, and in the end is simply not able to deliver the goods.
By 1968, O'Neill had been outflanked by the older forces of fear. Détente with the South was over. But in this year of rebellion, a movement rises in Northern Ireland to demand equal rights for Catholics. For the Ulster Protestants, the civil rights movement was the old Catholic conspiracy, not a movement for change inspired by the unrest of that momentous year. The following year, sectarian rioting erupted. The IRA, long in decline, re-emerged to present itself as the people's protector against a hostile state. Republican and loyalist paramilitaries, policemen and soldiers fought over the old ground.
Positively nothing fired at them whatsoever. There weren't even stones fired at them when they opened fire. People ran in all directions, called themselves an army. It was completely outrageous.
The bus station was crowded when a bomb went off without warning.
Within the space of 16 minutes alone, 13 blasts sent people screaming from one place of safety to another.
An army helicopter was flown in to remove the casualties, and this was then caught in a separate explosion.
There can be no question of political status. Crime is crime is crime.
The Provisional IRA have said they planted the bomb at the Brighton Hotel where Mrs. Thatcher and her ministers are staying.
Politics is the alternative to war. Politics is about dialogue. I'll talk to anyone. That doesn't mean that I approve of what they stand for.
The war occasionally spilled over into the South. But partition had entrenched a separation of the mind. The 6 counties of Ulster truly seemed a world away. In the Republic, a younger generation pursued its own narrative of change, pushing at the boundaries of church and of state. This changing sense of Irishness was the beginning